I would like to thank the Henry Moore Institute for inviting me to provide this presentation on monuments, sexuality, and contested spaces. I am Martin Zebracki, Associate Professor of Human Geography in the School of Geography at the University of Leeds. I've published widely at the crossroads of public art practice, sexuality, citizenship, digital culture, and processes of social inclusion and exclusion. I have an invested interest in the monuments and processes of memorialisation regarding gender and sexual minorities, in particular LGBT plus people, an acronym for people identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or any other gender or sexual characteristics. This interest not only transpires in the international AHRC-funded research project that I lead on so-called queer memorials, which underpins this talk, I've also been involved in LGBT plus activism firsthand. My talk draws preliminary insights from a salient case of failure, Tęcza, or Polish for rainbow. How can public spaces be memorialized through artwork? And what critical role may sexuality play in this to promote more inclusive spaces? I am bringing you to Warsaw, in Poland. Unveiled in this country's urban capital in 2012, this 26-meter wide rainbow-colored arc, depicted behind me, made by the artist Julita Wojciech, was introduced as a symbol of joy, peace, and connection. However, the artwork's perceived LGBT plus symbolism met heated opposition from a combination of ethno-nationalist, far-right, neo-fascist, and religiously conservative parties. The hostility against Tęcza, or what was deemed an importation of Western LGBT plus values by some, went hand in hand by repeated arson attacks, leading to its destruction and final removal just 3 years after its unveiling in 2015. The social reproduction of Tęcza has spanned post-material, including imagined and digital afterlives after its physical removal from public space. The debate about Tęcza continues to mark the increasingly precarious position of LGBT plus people within a growingly conservative national climate. My talk tracks the erratic journey of public engagement with Tęcza and discusses how the critical politics over LGBT plus memorialisation turned this public artwork into a dissonant or queer monument. So what are queer monuments? As written in a forthcoming joint paper authored by Ryan Leitner and myself in the Journal of Homosexuality, monuments in public space can lend visibility to the legacy of cultural and collective memory and legitimize present authority and prevailing norms. They may, therefore, operate as important tokens of dominant powers. Since the 1980s, there has been a memory turn amongst sexual and gender minorities to remember their past experience and struggles. This was accompanied with a rising number of so-called queer monuments, which can be seen as public objects, including artworks that are dedicated to and questioning or querying normativities around the lives of LGBT plus people. As such, we can render queer monuments as reactions or a sort of counter-monuments which relay alternative memories to hegemonic heteronormativities, as represented by the majority of public artwork that we can find on the street, including monuments, which have often been erected in the image of a white male, quote, hero on a horse, unquote, as the feminist art historian Arlene Raven put it. I want to foreground the use of the term queer, or rather its verbal form, queering, in a distinctive way alongside LGBT+. That is to say, it's employed here as a critical tenet in challenging or queering identity categories, representations, and assumptions and norms around sexuality and gender. Moving to the Tęcza case, what is the place of gender and sexual minorities as seen through a temporary rainbow-shaped artwork under the sky of Poland, which is pretty dark for LGBT+ people? How can an artwork like Tęcza or its afterlife memorialize gender and sexual others that have to date still remained invisible or placeless even? The highly conservative post-socialist context of Poland faces generally high levels of LGBT+ phobia, although the situation could be considered relatively more favorable in the country's capital of Warsaw and other major cities in Poland. Particularly since Poland's accession to the EU in 2004, notable LGBT+ advocacy groups, including Lambda Warszawa, established in 1997, a key partner of the Queer Memorials Project, and the Equality Foundation, have increasingly made efforts to put LGBT+ rights on agendas, both locally and nationally. However, same-sex unions are still not legally recognized in Poland, and LGBT+ people largely remain disadvantaged, especially considering the current right-wing nationalist Polish government, led by the Law and Justice Party, which further undermines the rights of gender and sexual minorities, particularly across women and LGBT+ people. Most recently, a rising number of local governments, particularly in the southeast of Poland, have established so-called LGBT-free zones. Moreover, the headline of a widely circulated op-ed in the New York Times from 2019 read, quote, Poland's populists pick a new top enemy, gay people, unquote. Jarosław Kaczyński, the leader of the Law and Justice Party, said in 2019, quote, we need to fight this. We need to defend the Polish family. We need to defend it fiercely because it's a threat to civilization, not just for Poland, but for the entire Europe, for the entire civilization that is based on Christianity, unquote. On top of that, Marek Siwicki, a well-known Catholic priest and educator in Poland, said, quote, it comes down to them waving a rainbow flag and trying to steal our internal values like truth, love, human life, family based on marriage, and morality based on Gospel and Decalogue, unquote. This is the overall context wherein the politics around Tęcza could be understood. What has been the rainbow's journey? I wrote down the following tour d'horizon in the previously mentioned forthcoming co-authored publication in the Journal of Homosexuality. The journey of Tęcza has been colorful, just like the artificial rainbow-colored flowers wired over its armature. Through the Artist in Residency program Flower Power, Julita Wojciech's first incarnation of Tęcza was a half-steel arc-shaped structure with cemetery flowers, which supported the walls of the former Comedolese monastery in the northeastern Polish town of Wigry in August 2010. The second and final variant of Tęcza comprised an 8-ton steel structure of 9 meter high and 26 meter wide. It took the guise of a community artwork, as Wojciech worked with volunteers in workshops in the coastal town of Sopot and the southern rural town of Wilamowicz, near Oswiecim, better known as Auschwitz, to decorate a rainbow structure which counted over 60,000 ersatz flowers. All components, including the arc-shaped structure itself, were transported to Brussels and then assembled in front of the EU Commission building on 17 September 2011, done in honor of Poland's rotating EU presidency. It is interesting to ponder on whether this may have reinforced opponents' image of Tęcza as an emblem of the pro-LGBT+ agenda of the EU and the West. Tęcza was transported from Brussels to Warsaw in winter 2012 at the initiative of Adam Mickiewicz Institute, which is a key government-sponsored cultural organization. It was erected in the middle of a busy roundabout in Saviour Square, adjacent to the Church of the Holiest Saviour, on 8 June 2012. This middle was closed off for pedestrians and put under CCTV. The large structure could not escape the eye of bystanders, such as pedestrians, cyclists, drivers, train passengers, and customers of the surrounding cafes and restaurants. Tęcza was not created as a permanent public artwork in the first place. It fell under a temporary agreement between the initiator and sponsor, which was the Adam Mickiewicz Institute, which is a relatively progressive cultural state organization, and the city of Warsaw. Also, against the background of state conservatism and Tęcza as a liberal LGBT+ sign, a paradox resided in the state sponsorship of this public artwork. Wojciech's reported intention for Tęcza was different, to say the least, from conservative and right-wing backlash. With its rainbow-colored artificial flowers, the artist wanted to create a universal symbol, eliciting the rainbow's long history of, what she said, positive associations. The artist wanted to give expression to abstract values, as mentioned, such as beauty, joy, love, peace, hope, and optimism, adding that her, quote, main message was that the rainbow is not socially or politically involved, but is free of any kind of imposed meanings, simply there to be beautiful, unquote. In an interview with the New York Times, Wojciech conveyed that the rainbow, in light of Poland's reputation as a, quote, homophobic country, promoted that, quote, we are not closed but open-minded. Whilst the artist acknowledged Tęcza's reference to, quote, movements on behalf of the emancipation of sexual minorities, unquote, the artist initially denied this connection. Concurrently, Wojciech imparted that the rainbow figure may symbolize the covenant between God and humankind, indeed fortified by Tęcza's proximity to the Saviour Church. So, one might think that this narrative would sound like music to a Polish Catholic's ears. However, a discursive consolidation of religiously conservative, far-right and neo-fascist echelons of Polish society, as well as conservative Catholic political leaders, rather took umbrage against Tęcza. This large, hyper-visible public artwork associated with the LGBT plus pride flag, situated next to the Saviour Church, was rather read by them as homosexual propaganda promulgated by the West, allegedly insulting Polish national and Catholic values. Such perception did not just drop out of the sky, considering high-profile controversial comments of Lech Kaczynski, as just mentioned. Feelings about Tęcza were running high, putting it mildly. Whilst it stood for a desired progressive future for some, opponents saw in it an unwanted social order, requiring immediate radical counteraction. And some significant counteractions followed indeed, rendering Tęcza as a kind of anti-monument to the religious conservative and Catholic family values and ethno-nationalist feelings that dominate large segments of everyday life in Poland to date. Despite strong levels of social control in a lively place such as Warsaw city centre, there were repeated arson attempts against this artwork, 7 times in total. A notable arson attack was caused by far-right nationalists during National Independence Day demonstrations on 11 November 2013. This incident was followed by a kiss-in demonstration under the surviving remnants of the structure a few days later. Notwithstanding the sustained assaults, Tęcza was painstakingly renovated upon each of them, with the moral support from leading figures, including activists, artists, and the then mayor, who stated that, quote, "The city authorities will rebuild the rainbow many times if necessary," unquote, which turned out to happen 5 times. However, the authorities removed the structure when a temporary agreement between its caretaker, the Adam Mickiewicz Institute, and the city of Warsaw terminated in August 2015. Tęcza was then harbored in the collection of Warsaw's Center for Contemporary Art. As part of its Late Polishness exhibition in 2017, the center invited the public to donate private photographic memories of this artwork to its public collection on collective memory and national identity since 1989. Relocation of Tęcza to a public site is under debate and facilitated by the Adam Mickiewicz Institute that solicits ideas from the wider public. As conservatism is ever increasing in Poland, it might prove to be a challenging target to secure a new, not to mention permanent, place for Tęcza, or read a largely perceived LGBT plus symbol under the sky of Warsaw. Despite the relatively more favorable situation for LGBT plus people in the country's urban capital. In all, this tells a queer story about Tęcza, especially seeing that the practices and discourses surrounding it have been ambivalent and antagonistic. Although not originally instigated as an LGBT plus monument by the artist, this landmark has become largely perceived and memorialized as such, in simultaneously positive and abject ways. Within the purview of the lack of a larger, widely shared political commitment to fight forms of sexual and gender prejudice and inequality in Poland, Tęcza became part of the struggle against LGBT plus phobia and bigotry. And so it turned into a public conversation piece, a notion that Grant Kester associated with artwork driven by dialogue and high level of social engagements. Tęcza forms a compelling case to expand on how public discussion and contestation took place over LGBT+ symbolism, and how it has been living on in so doing. There has been a powerful symbolic convergence around the artwork's visual content and its locational, temporal, and social contexts, which charted a delicate course between sentiments and acts of LGBT+ solidarity and rejection around Tęcza's legacy. The artist Julita Wojciech conveyed that neither the date of Tęcza's unveiling nor its location was just accidental. It coincided with the annual Equality Parade in Warsaw, organized since 2001, the Polish national holiday, Corpus Christi, and the start of UEFA Euro 2012, which was co-hosted by Poland and the Ukraine. The rainbow was also site-specific, as is chimed with the curved architecture of the roundabout and the buildings and arcades surrounding it. Also, Saviour Square, with its cafes and restaurants, is known as a hipster hangout, frequented by queer artists and folks. Tęcza's temporal materiality, or the installation in rainbow LGBT+ iconography, has left a footprint on the public's mind and imaginary. The various social appropriations of Tęcza have demonstrated that it has not just been a fleeting bystander. Material monuments and enactments can have a particularly critical impact on public memory. Indeed, Tęcza has been operating as an in-your-face LGBT+ material symbol for Warsaw and the rest of the country, thereby producing a resonant impact or a kind of public monumentality. After its removal in 2015, Tęcza continued mediating a debate about LGBT+ visibility and rights, making possible or restraining certain encounters and political claims for sexual and gender minorities. Tęcza's ephemeron embodies an anti-normative rhythm, disrupting the patronage of much permanence statues and monuments that represent heteronormativity. Rather, the case of Tęcza speaks to the fleeting character of queer public art, the dynamism of urban queer spaces and times, as well as the importance of archival practices in doing research on the temporality of queer cultures, as is done in the Queer Memorials Project. Tęcza is still present in its physical absence. When I interviewed residents from Warsaw, including members of the public and activists, in September 2018, so when Tęcza was no longer in place, participants relayed an immediately felt proximity. They elicited vivid memories and lived experiences of key happenings around Tęcza. Such memories and experiences stretched beyond the artwork's original site and alluded to highly polarized attitudes and political agendas that affect sexual and gender minorities in the Polish society very differently. The artwork manifestly appeared to function as a much-needed symbol in the politics of visibility as pursued by LGBT plus activists and their allies. Ongoing conservative and far-right opposition and belligerence gave rise to reappropriations of Tęcza as politicized statements. The conflict has galvanized some creative knock-on reactions beyond the country's urban capital in the guise of counter-monuments to traditionalist, parochial, anti-LGBT plus values. Such counteractions ranged from site-specific performances, such as the symbolic burning of a rainbow at Tęcza's locality, to rainbow murals that began to appear in cities elsewhere in Poland. Apparently, Tęcza was successful at setting the tone and parameters for queering conformative ways of life in Poland, and establishing space for the visibility and rights of LGBT plus people. As another case in point, in 2017, the small northeastern town of Zebracki in Poland's conservative Podlasie province saw unknown people painting over a fan-shaped concrete sculpture titled Garden of Arts. This was done in a rainbow color scheme, in reported reference to Tęcza. The town's mayor condemned this as an act of vandalism. However, there might have been an implicit concern with how a symbol associated with LGBT plus identity seeped into this conservative town. As another significant event, Tęcza became reimagined in its original location, the Savior Square, in the capacity as a water and light hologram installation, as depicted here, which has been playing with this artwork's queer ephemerality. It was presented as an unbreakable comeback. It assumed the size that was similar to the original. It lasted for a few hours from the end of the night before the Equality Parade in Warsaw, 9 June 2018. The creative agency 180 Heartbeats plus Young versus Matt created this waterlight-based hologram for an LGBT plus equality campaign for Unilever's Ben & Jerry's. The agency's chief officer said, quote, "We hope that Poland will become even a little more tolerant because it's high time for that," unquote. It could be argued that the previous examples of the recurrent reclaiming of Tęcza in original and different locations, which widely journeyed through news and social media, turned this art piece into a sort of networked monument of the ongoing struggle for LGBT plus rights in Poland, and perhaps in neighboring conservative contexts alike. These multi-site examples can be regarded as artistically informed grassroots activism, or forms of artivism. The latter draws attention to and politicizes the presence of LGBT plus people through the mode of art practice and the use of the rainbow color scheme. The reappropriations of Tęcza beyond its locale and lifetime indicate how this artwork, after its material destruction, lives on through a kind of ghost effect, and is thereby held in vivid memory in public, artistic, as well as academic discourse, through this outlet, for example. In this place, it is, that said, important to note that LGBT plus culture and symbolism may risk being incorporated as instruments into political and marketing strategies to promote diversity and progressive citizenship, which then would eat away from their potential to be queer. When I participated in the Equality Parade in Warsaw in 2018, I witnessed how rainbow flags and colors abundantly adorned the floats of major companies such as Google and Netflix that took part in that parade. They passed among the first ones as if this were to provide some kind of symbolic hierarchy of importance. And to what extent was this Tęcza-inspired hologram co-facilitated by the Equality Parade's key sponsor Ben & Jerry's, perhaps, in part, a marketing ploy? On the other side of the coin, such companies may contribute to raise LGBT+ visibility and empathy awareness through mass content sharing, amongst other avenues. There should also be noted that the use of the rainbow symbol has not only been criticized for any inflated uses, such as soberly commercial appropriations, but also for its limits to intersectional representations of sexual and gender others, for example, lesbians, trans people, and people of color. Nevertheless, it can still be a very useful tool for navigation and for showing visibility of gender and sexual minorities.
LGBT plus progress is not always linear. Their pursuit of solidarity for sexual and gender minorities can be unbalanced and incoherent and have unequal impacts across identity markers beyond sexuality and gender, including ethnicity, class, age, and nationality. Such matters have been widely critiqued under the notion of homo-nationalism, criticizing LGBT plus commodity culture, as well as systemic state practices of pinkwashing. That is to say, to what extent do pro-LGBT plus policies and practices translate into any material changes for all sexual and gender minorities? And can other minorities build on the gains of LGBT plus inclusion and rights recognition? To what extent are steps taken in favor of the situation of some, but at the expense of minority others from within, so to say, such as women, trans people, migrants, and people of color? And to what extent might processes camouflage the oppression of other communities marginalized along ethnic, class, and religious lines, amongst others? In this regard, what do queer monuments have in the offer for more inclusive LGBT plus futures beyond urban window dressing? The profiling of political parties and enterprises under the LGBT plus flag, and by extension LGBT plus related monuments, might be rendered unqueer should they conceal underlying interests that have little to nothing to do with the situation of sexual and gender minorities. Nevertheless, political and commercial sponsorship can be indispensable for LGBT plus key events, such as pride marches, that involve substantial funding and organizational capital. Without such sponsorship, LGBT visibility might get compromised or further compromised, especially within contexts such as Poland, which manifests a stark lack of financial and moral support from political and societal leaders. Following Tęcza's destruction, there does no longer seem to be a formally commissioned permanent artwork or monument in a prominent public space in Poland that relays such an explicit, symbolic, commemorative link with LGBT plus people and their struggles. The LGBT plus rights movement remains challenged, given Poland's politico-social condition. The EU has repeatedly blown the whistle, seeing that the independence of the judiciary, press freedom, and protection of minoritarian populations, including sexual and gender minorities, have been progressively jeopardized. Most recently, as said, this has been the case when a rising number of local governments, particularly in the southeast of Poland, issued so-called LGBT-free zones. In Poland's foreseeable future, the instigation of something like a permanent LGBT plus beacon, let alone the implementation of pro-LGBT plus legislation, will likely fall on deaf ears. Nevertheless, the debate about LGBT plus rights in Poland has been reignited with Tęcza. It has become a strong symbol, an LGBT symbol, not only for Warsaw, but also in the context of the national discourse. So Tęcza, as a kind of discursive and visual politics, has seemed to play an ambiguous part in visibilizing versus effacing sexual and gender difference amongst opponents and proponents. It yet remains tricky to produce claims on the impacts of a single LGBT plus related public artwork on wider social and activist, including artivist movements that propagate LGBT plus inclusion. I see Tęcza as a pivotal test case for queering monuments. This would reveal a commitment to the interrogation of the ambivalent aspects of visibility versus invisibility, actions versus counteractions, and legacy regarding the roles that such monuments can play across contexts of protecting conservatism versus activating room for more inclusive change for LGBT plus people. Concerted efforts in this sphere would and should motivate a politics of recognition of the rights of not LGBT plus populations alone, but the socially marginalized communities more widely, again, including women, trans people, migrants, and people of color. Consequently, queering should not only engage troubled situations in the here and now. Rather, it forms a prolonged project of universal anticipation and commitment regarding people in different places and times, pursuing alliances with the oppressed beyond sexual minority status alone. So, there would be no queer collegiality without a transnational and intersectional solidarity. To conclude, a story about the here and the now is a story about there and then. The multi-layered Tęcza story teaches us that it is important to remain vigilant and exude criticism of particular uses versus misuses and appropriations versus misappropriations regarding both material and immaterial legacies of queer monuments, or in this case, art that has become queer. I encourage peers to think about the following questions. How do queer monuments serve LGBT plus marginalized communities, and to what extent do they address or overlook, stay in touch or lose touch with the everyday lived realities of oppression within and beyond sexual and gender minorities? How can queer monuments then advance pathways for impacting creative practices, policies, and social change? Thank you very much for your attention.